Well, howdy there, stranger. I'm Jordy,
And I'm Brad.
and welcome back to Beers with Queers, the true crime podcast where I research a case and Brad here, and potentially you guys.
Don't know a damn thing about it. But today, it's me that's bringing the murder and mayhem. That's right, Jordy gets to take a break.
Another Brad episode. We're starting to get into a little pattern here. So I'm enjoying it. You guys are enjoying it. So I'm excited to see what Brad has in store for us this week.
All right, before we get into today's case, I just want to take a moment and say thank you. The response to my last episode was incredible. I read every single comment, message, and review, and I truly took your feedback to heart. Some of it was encouraging, some of it was constructive, and all of it just made a lot of sense. And that's the kind of input that helps me grow, not just as a storyteller, but as someone who really wants to get this right for you guys.
Yeah. Very awesome. So many people provided their feedback on Brad's last episode before last. It was very constructive. People were very honest. They loved it. They talked about like everything they loved, what they'd like to see, and really appreciate that because, we can't grow or learn unless we hear from you guys. So really appreciate it. It was a new format, first time trying it, and as we do it more and more, we're going to strike the right balance of everything you guys want and love. And no, I thought it was a really good episode. If you haven't listened to it, the last two are actually it wasn't a two-parter because Brad did one, I did one, but they fed off each other because they are related. So if you haven't listened to them, I highly recommend you do because it's one of those cases that will send you down as many rabbit holes as you want, as many holes as you want.
Yeah, and like I said before, Jordy has presented most of the cases so far, so I'm still trying to get my feet under me and trying to find the way I want to do them and the way that you want me to do them and finding that balance in the middle. So this week, I've made some changes. I've applied your suggestions, tightened the structure, adjusted the tone, and I really hope you notice the difference. I'm still finding my groove, like I said, but my goal is that one day when you see it's a Brad episode, your reaction isn't, oh, it's a Brad episode, and it's, oh, it's a Brad episode. Big difference.
Yeah, and I think, of course, also me and Brad have two very distinct storytelling styles. I have done like 90% of the episodes so far, but that number is slowly evening out as the podcast goes along.
It's going to take a few years for me to even that score out.
But it has gone into a little groove here in the last few months.
I mean, I'll be honest, part of this is just because we are so busy with life right now. For one person to always have to do the case, yeah, that's a lot of responsibility, a lot of work. And with changes in life and everything like that, this is like my way of really trying to keep the podcast going on a weekly schedule rather than it having to go to like a bi-weekly with just Jordy doing everything.
And it was, that's a big thing. You may notice that Brad is doing a lot more episodes. And partially that is because, there's a lot of life changes. I've not talked about this on the podcast or really anywhere, but, I got laid off from my last job in November. Yeah, last week in November. And that job was very much completely work from home, kind of made my own schedule. So I had pretty ample time to write all the scripts and keep up with the schedule. But I started a new job in January, and it's kind of still pretty lax, but it's a bit more hands-on for me. So I'm not having as much time to dedicate to writing multiple scripts at once as I would like. So really appreciate Brad stepping up to the plate and kind of taking on more of the podcast. I just want to say of the podcast.
I'm usually the behind the scenes guy. I edit the podcasts, I handle the social media aspects of it, but I really needed to step this up, especially with Pride coming up next month. And it is going to be a super busy schedule. We are booked every weekend until summer's over, pretty much.
Yeah, and as Pride, that's probably when we're at our peak because this is a gay related podcast. Still not sure of all the things I want to do for you guys this coming Pride. We always try to do something special. Still, I think I have a case in mind that I want to cover across a couple of weeks. And on top of that, I'm trying to what else can we do to make the podcast grow? So maybe, I'm saying a big maybe, if we can find the time, maybe we can have a little merch drop or something. I don't know. I want to do something though. It's Pride Month. All eyes are on the queer community, so we shall see. I'm still ironing out the details. But yes, Brad has really, I think a lot of people have also noticed that Brad has gotten more and more invested with the podcast as time went on, and which is really, really cool. I love it. I know you guys love it. And it's also really cool too because the more we do it, the more I can tell that he does get into it because he'll be like, did you know this happened? Did you know about this? Did you know that this law because of this case? And I was like, some I do know, some I don't know. So I really appreciate the fact that you're getting really into it. And that just makes the podcast even better. And I know you guys love it.
And so I'm going to present the new case today. And as always, I want to know what you think. So give me some more feedback, and hopefully I'm going to start finding my groove as we go ahead.
Yeah, I'm interested to see what you've tweaked, what you've applied, and stuff like that. And obviously, I'm here to help as well. You guys critique me as well if there's anything I do that you guys don't like to.
I think the main thing was that people wanted the story was nice. Everybody enjoyed that aspect of it and everything, but it didn't really leave as much space for us to talk back and forth.
That is the biggest constructive criticism that we got was, and very valid, was that a lot of people do prefer the more laid back, casual, like a good mix of both, like good chunks here where it's very formal. Here's the facts. But then every once in a while, break that up with like this, where it's just kind of like asking questions, just kind of talking about the case. And 100%, I think that's my favorite top two. And yeah, so we are here to serve you guys and present this in the most appealing way possible from the podcasting couch. So I had to throw that in there too before we got started because our friend Aaron was very much kept saying over and over, he's like, I've still yet to hear you refer to your new couch setup for the podcast as the podcasting couch. So I'm throwing that in there for him.
That's for you, buddy.
So yes, we are, our official place of where we record the podcast is called the podcasting couch, which I might turn that into a sticker. That's actually a really good idea. But anyway, I'm ready to get into today's case. Hopefully you guys are ready. I am excited and also curious to see what Brad has in store for us.
So with that, let's get into the case. It was around 10 p.m. on a warm Saturday in Bangor, Maine, July 7th, 1984. Two young men had been walking across the State Street Bridge, but only one would make it to the other side. Charlie Howard was 23 years old. He was asthmatic, he was openly gay, and he was running. Behind him, three teenage boys, all under 18. They'd spotted him minutes earlier near downtown. They got out of their car and gave chase. Witnesses would later describe it as a hunt. Charlie's partner, Roy Ogden, managed to get away, but Charlie, already wheezing from an asthma attack, collapsed. The boys caught up to him near the bridge. They beat him, and then they lifted him over the concrete railing and dropped him in. Let's see how to say that. Kunduskeg. Charlie's partner, Roy Ogden, managed to get away, but Charlie, already wheezing from an asthma attack, collapsed. The boys caught up to him near the bridge. They beat him, and then they lifted him over the concrete railing and dropped him in, down into the Kenduskeag stream. And from the surface of the water came his voice, a final plea. I can't swim. That's what he said, and that's what they ignored. He struggled for a moment, and then he went under. Roy pulled the nearest fire alarm. Emergency crews arrived quickly. They dragged the water. They searched with spotlights. But when Charlie's body was recovered nearly 3 hours later, it was too late. According to the autopsy, he had drowned, but it wasn't instant. His lungs showed signs of panic, of struggle. The asthma had likely paralyzed his chest before the water could. And while that stream ran silent, the boys, the ones who threw him in, returned to a party, laughing about what they had done. That's not a rumor. That's from the court records, witness testimony, and sworn statements. For a few hours, Charlie Howard's death wasn't a headline. It was just a rumor. Passed between teens, whispered at gas stations, ignored by adults who didn't want to believe. But by morning, that silence would break. Because this wasn't just a drowning. This wasn't just a beating. This was a hate crime. And it would force a quiet town in northern Maine to decide what kind of place it really was. A violent end for a man who had already had his fair share of violence, targeted just for being visible. But Charlie Howard had always been visible, sometimes by choice, sometimes not. And he learned early on that visibility was brave, but it was also dangerous. Do you know this story?
I actually do know this story. I'm sure you're going to bring up why I know this story because it's related to something pretty popular.
I am going to bring that up.
So I'll let you talk about that. But yes, I am aware of this story. I'm not aware of all the details, but I do know like the overall gist of he got chased down, thrown into the river. I don't actually remember how it ended. So I'm very curious to see where this goes because it can go either really justice could be served, which would be really good and really ideal, or it could go the way that I'm dreading. And yeah, we know how this usually goes, especially in the 80s.
Charlie was born on January 31st, 1961, in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. From the very beginning, Charlie was different. Not in some abstract way, but in ways that people saw and commented on, even as a child. He had severe asthma, which kept him out of sports and often out of school. He was expressive, creative. He wrote poetry. He preferred music to mischief. His clothes were colorful. His voice was soft. And long before he could articulate why, people began calling him names, mocking him. He was bullied badly. Not just teased, isolated, threatened, assaulted. And the worst part wasn't that the adults didn't stop it. It was that many didn't see it as a problem. Back then, in schools and churches and dinner tables across small-town New England, queerness wasn't discussed unless it was being condemned. He grew up in the church, a place that had once been a constant in his life. Familiar hymns, familiar faces, that quiet rhythm on Sunday mornings. It was part of his upbringing, a place where he should have comfort. But when Charlie began to come out, first to his close friends, and more openly, something shifted. The response from the church wasn't warmth. It wasn't pastoral care. It was rejection.
It is always so weird. Like, you know, a lot of queer people growing up is people like bullies and shitheads seem to notice that they're gay or, you know, quote unquote different before they even do. Like I've talked to so many people, it's like, I didn't even know that I was gay and they clocked it immediately. So it's like, I don't know how, or they're just looking for it, but it is crazy how people automatically assume stuff about you and just latch onto it, especially in small town America, which I'm sure a lot of us are familiar with.
Especially in school, and when you're in the South in the Bible Belt, you get it even extra.
You get it from school, you get it from church, and of course, small towns, people talk, and it's just very unchristian like.
That boy's got a little sugar in his step.
We actually watched a movie, not to take away from the seriousness of this case, we actually watched a movie not too long ago that was kind of like this. It was set in the South and it followed a character who was openly queer. And the wife of the pastor was like, "He flaunts it like a little Lord Fauntleroy." And I didn't know what that was, but apparently it's a book, and I'm assuming it's tied to being queer somehow because they kept calling him a little Lord Fauntleroy, and it was an interesting term I've never heard before, so they're getting creative with their slurs.
According to those close to him, church leaders made it clear that Charlie's identity was incompatible with their teachings. He was asked not to participate in certain ministries. At one point, he was told that his presence made others uncomfortable. There was no formal excommunication, but the message was unmistakable. He was no longer welcome as he was. That kind of quiet exile cuts deep, especially for someone like Charlie who believed in community, who sought belonging. He didn't leave faith behind entirely, but he left that church, and that departure would stay with him, and it left a mark. So Charlie learned early that surviving meant navigating cruelty and being shunned just for who he was. He developed a resilience that by some accounts came off as flamboyance. But the truth was, it was just his survival. As a young adult, Charlie drifted from New Hampshire to Maine in search of community, stability, a place where he wouldn't have to explain himself just to exist. By 1984, he had landed in Bangor. At that time, Bangor, Maine was a working-class city of about 33,000 people. It had once been a blooming lumber port, one of the wealthiest towns per capita in the country, but that wealth had long faded. What remained was quieter, more insulated place, a place where everybody knew everybody, or at least they thought they did. A place where being different wasn't just noticed, it was often punished. There was no legal protections for queer people in Maine in 1984, no anti-discrimination statutes, no hate crime laws. Being openly gay in Bangor meant being vulnerable. It meant walking down Main Street and bracing for the sound of tires slowing or a voice yelling a slur, or worse. But Charlie wasn't trying to hide anymore. He moved into a small apartment on 2nd Street, lived modestly. His only roommate was his gray cat named Tiger. He decorated the place with care, and he was just trying to build a life. One of the first places he found community was in the Unitarian Universalist Church on Union Street. It was one of the only religious institutions in Bangor that openly supported queer people at the time. Through that church, Charlie joined Interweave, a local support group for gay, lesbian, and trans individuals. This group was small, maybe a dozen people at most, but for him, it was life-changing. For the first time, Charlie could just sit in a room and breathe, and be himself. And that is also where he met Roy Ogden. Roy was thoughtful, soft-spoken, a few years older than Charlie. Their relationship started as friendship, but deepened quickly. They shared a sense of being outsiders, of trying to create safety where there wasn't much of it to go around. They became partners, romantically, emotionally, and practically. They cooked together, walked to church together. They sat side by side in interweave meetings. According to members of the group, their affection was clear, even if it wasn't always publicly demonstrated. In 1984, even holding hands in public could be a dangerous act. So they were careful, but they were close. Roy would later describe Charlie as someone who felt things deeply, who laughed hard, sang often, and loved without hesitation. He also said Charlie was afraid, not in the abstract, but in the real day-to-day way. He began to talk about being followed, about threats, about a sense of something might happen, that someone might try to hurt him. Still, Charlie chose to live visibly.
That is a very valid concern. I mean, even like personally, 2025, honestly, been very fortunate. I think Brad and I both have been very fortunate. We've never really dealt with outward homophobia from people in public, but it's still always a concern. And less so that, like, if someone like said something to me, very much so, I have no issue confronting them personally. But you never know how these people will react. They could have a gun, a weapon, and so it's really scary that people are bold enough to just walk up to you and try to at least do Lord knows what. So it is a very valid fear, especially as we get closer to Pride. like I said, all eyes are going to be on the queer community, and that's a good thing and a bad thing because there's going to be a lot of people, especially in America currently, that are going to use that as an excuse to actively try to harass queer people. So that's always like a lingering fear of dread going into, like, or I wouldn't say dread, but nervousness. And so I completely get that feeling of just literally like I'm walking down the street trying to get groceries and you have to worry about someone attacking you.
Not to get into this story too deep and get off topic, but we had a friend that come in from Moulin Rouge, and we took him out to show him the town and everything. And it was really the first time we've had somebody just walk up and just start talking to us. He was like, "Obviously, you're gay," to our friend, and then was like, "And you guys are straight." And I was like, "Nope, nope, we're not." And he's like, "That's okay. I like gay people." He like lowered his voice, but then he started going, "But these trans people," and getting into sports and everything like that. And I was like, "Brother, you are in the wrong place trying to like sell this," you know. And after a long argument and asking him to please you leave, we didn't want to have this conversation. You know, we just finally had to like walk away and let it be. But it was like the first time that I've ever had one of those conversations just with someone on the street that just decided to walk up and just start spilling propaganda to me or whatever. And so times are a changing. You know, right now we're in a weird climate. So you got to be prepared for people just walking up and all of a sudden, you know, hey, you don't live like I want you to. So I'm going to tell you why you're wrong.
Yeah, and it, like it said, it's completely unprompted, really weird. I don't know what compels some people to do it, but that's what I'm saying. Like, if people are just willing to walk up to strangers and talk like that, you never know what they're gonna do. People are unwell out there, so like we always say, stay dangerous out there. Travel in groups if you go out to Pride and stuff like that, and just be very vigilant. It sucks that we have to say that, but it's a very scary time we're living in 2025. And this case happened in 1984. So it shows you that we've made a lot of strides, but it's still a long way to go before we have, no fears of just walking down the street, minding our own business.
Back to it. Charlie continued to live visibly. He loved La Cage aux Folles, the Broadway musical, and I probably did not say that right, especially the song I Am What I Am. He sang it often, not in private, not sheepishly, but as a kind of anthem. He believed in authenticity, even when it came at a cost, and it often did for a gay man back then. Charlie endured frequent harassment in Bangor. People yelled slurs at him from passing cars. Teenagers followed him on foot. Once someone threw a rock at him, and he tried to laugh it off, said he wouldn't let them win. But privately, the fear was growing, not just for himself, but for Roy too. And can you imagine that kind of life? From all accounts, Charlie was obviously a gay man. Just to look at him, to hear him, and he didn't try to hide it at all. He was proud of who he was and everything. But just because he was visibly a gay man, people would throw rocks at him just for walking down the street. Can you imagine what kind of life that is? That's so scary.
It's very scary and it's very unfortunate. And it's, I think it's one of those things where he, I don't want to say chose, but he was unafraid of living authentically, as a way to not let them win and to let other people know, like, it's okay to be quote unquote different or visibly queer. And, I'm not going to let people's bigotry and hatred towards something they don't understand stop me from living my life how I want to live it. But it just shows you like the cost of sadly living like that in a society that doesn't act like it wants to understand sometimes.
And this isn't just like people that was like, "Oh, I can't stand by his lifestyle." These are strangers on the street. They don't know this man. I mean, it's a small community and everything, but from all accounts, Charlie didn't talk to many people outside of his small groups that he felt safe in. So these are basically strangers that feel like, oh, because of how he's dressed, I'm going to throw a rock at this man. I don't know. It's just, it blows my mind. This case bothers me in a lot of ways. On Saturday, July 7th, 1984, the two spent the evening at a potluck hosted by Interweave at the Unitarian Church. It was one of their safe spaces. They brought food, helped clean up, talked with friends late into the evening. Charlie wore his signature white pants and lightweight scarf that night. It was summer, but he always liked a little flair. Friends said he was smiling that evening, present and at ease, around his own people. After the event around 10 p.m., Roy needed to check his P.O. box downtown. The post office was only a few blocks away, just across the State Street Bridge that spans the Condesteg Stream. The post office was just a few blocks away, just across the State Street Bridge that spans the Condesteg Stream. They walked side by side, quietly. The air was thick with humidity. One of those nights where you feel like you're walking through water. For someone with asthma, it could also be hard to breathe. But there was no panic. There was no sense that anything was wrong. Just two men in their 20s walking downtown after a church potluck. There's no record of them being loud, no confrontation, no escalation. They were just there, but they were visible. But in Bangor, in 1984, that visibility was often interpreted as a challenge and something that needed to be put in its place. They didn't know it, but they had been seen. A car passed them, slowed, and from that moment on, they were no longer just walking. They were being hunted. But for Charlie and Roy at that moment, it was just another summer night, another act of quiet defiance in a town that demanded silence. They kept walking, not knowing what was coming, not knowing how close the danger already was. The car slowed. Inside were 5 teenagers, 3 boys, Sean Mabry, Daniel Ness, and James Baines, and 2 girls, both minors, whose names were never publicly released. According to police reports and court records, the group had been driving around Bangor that Saturday night in a borrowed car, smoking, drinking, and looking for something to do. Boredom was the stated mood, but what happened next wasn't spontaneous. As the car turned onto State Street, someone in the back seat spotted the 2 men walking ahead, Charlie Howard and Roy Ogden. Charlie's scarf was visible, his posture expressive, and according to sworn testimony later provided by the boys themselves, their reaction wasn't confused or curious. It was hostile. One of them, records differ on which, said something to the effect of, "Let's go mess with the faggots." It wasn't a heat-of-the-moment slur. It was a declaration, a pretext, something that they had joked about earlier that night, according to multiple interviews conducted during the investigation. They circled the block once, then again. The second time around, they pulled over, and the 3 boys got out of the car. Roy and Charlie were already partway across the State Street Bridge when they realized they were being followed. There's no indication that they knew who these boys were. There was no confrontation leading up to it, no fight, no provocation, just footsteps behind them and rising fear. Roy later told police that they started running. Roy, slightly ahead, darted down an alley and just out of sight. Charlie, not far behind, began to falter. He was wheezing and struggling to breathe. The warm July air was heavy, and he had left his inhaler at home. He didn't make it far. Near the south end of the bridge, Charlie collapsed. His asthma had overtaken him. He couldn't run, he couldn't yell, and the boys closed in. According to court testimony, Sean Mabry punched Charlie first. Then James Baines joined in. A shove, a kick. One of them grabbed Charlie by the arms, the other took his legs, and without pause, they lifted him over the concrete guardrail of the bridge. Charlie begged them not to. We know Charlie told the boys, "I can't swim," and that didn't come from any witnesses. It came from the boys themselves, in their own statements. They admitted that they heard Charlie say it, and then they threw him in. He hit the surface of the Condesteg stream hard. The water was high that season, swollen with summer rain, but not deep enough to break a fall. And Charlie, with no strength or no air left, who we know couldn't swim, went under. From the bridge, the boys stood for a moment watching. They walked back to their car and got in. They didn't flee town. They didn't hide. Instead, they went to a nearby house party just a few blocks away. According to multiple witnesses, statements taken from the partygoers that night, the boys were laughing, and they had bragged about what they had done. One of them used the phrase Chuckahomo Bridge, as if they had renamed it. Some of the guests said they didn't believe the story. Others said they didn't know what to do, but no one called the police. Back on the bridge, Roy Ogden had returned, panicked, breathless, and alone. He'd circled back after losing the attackers, only to find the bridge empty. Charlie was gone, no sign of him, just the silence of the water moving beneath the street. There were no emergency phones nearby, no cell phones back in 1984. The only way to alert authorities quickly was to pull a public fire alarm, so that's what Roy did. He sprinted up State Street and pulled the handle of the nearest emergency box. The alarm shrieked into the quiet night, echoing through the downtown. Within minutes, Bangor police and fire crews arrived. Roy tried to explain what had happened, but he was in shock. He told him his partner had been thrown into the stream. He didn't know where. He didn't know if he could swim. The response was immediate. Rescue teams deployed boats, divers entered the water, and flashlights scanned the surface. Emergency crews combed both sides of the stream with search dogs and floodlights. The Condesteg stream isn't wide, but it's deceptively dangerous. Shallow in places, rocky in others, with sudden drops and undertows, it cuts through the center of Bangor like a fault line. Search efforts continued into the early morning hours, and at 12:58, Charlie's body was recovered. He was face down, partially submerged, snagged near a retaining wall. Paramedics attempted to resuscitate him, but it was too late. After Charlie's body was pulled from the Condesteg stream, Roy Ogden didn't disappear. He could have, but he had just witnessed the man he had loved being chased, assaulted, and thrown to his death, targeted for nothing more than being gay, for walking openly with his partner through their own city. He was terrified, grieving, and alone. But he didn't back down. When the police arrived on the scene, Roy gave a full statement. According to police reports, he described everything in detail, what he and Charlie were doing that night, where they were walking, when they noticed the boys behind them, and how they had tried to run. He told them about Charlie's asthma, about the fire alarm he pulled when Charlie didn't resurface. He gave names where he could, descriptions, directions, and he didn't hold anything back. And Roy did this at a time when many queer people feared law enforcement as much as their attackers. Roy stepped forward. He spoke clearly despite of his grief, despite the risk, despite knowing full well that some of the community might dismiss him for this, or even worse.
And that's one of the, still to this day, the queer community has a very tumultuous relationship with law enforcement, and for very good reason. A lot of times they're dismissed. A lot of the times they're outed to the public. A lot of the times they're harassed by the people that are supposed to protect them. And yeah, it's a very valid response. And that's actually brave too, especially in the 80s to come out to law enforcement as gay, just to be like, hey, you need to do something about this. And so that shows a very clear, I don't know, it's hard to explain. It's hard and I think it's really hard for some people to wrap their brain around, like, oh, it's law enforcement. They're supposed to protect you and be there. It's like, well, not always. That's not always the case. And it's terrifying to think that you could go to them to report this. And if they find out that you're gay or something else they don't like, well, then not only are they going to dismiss it, but they're also going to start harassing you for it or even arrest you. So it's just such a horrible, horrible situation.
So it was really brave of Roy to give this statement. And that seems so weird because, we've got so many cases where people are like, why didn't they tell the police? And this is what they had to deal with. So this is going back to just him making a statement saying, my partner got thrown into the river rather than my friend or something like that, but my partner who I love got thrown into this river is very brave of him, especially at this time. Brave even today, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
The autopsy conducted by the state medical examiner listed the official cause of death as asphyxia due to drowning, but it also noted signs of an acute asthma attack, likely triggered during the chase and exasperated by the trauma of the assault and the shock of being thrown into the water. He hadn't died instantly. That detail would haunt people. Charlie had tried to breathe. He had tried to survive, and he just wasn't able to. News of the death didn't take long to spread. Bangor was a tightly knit town in 1984. Word passed from neighbor to neighbor. By morning, dozens of residents knew something awful had happened near the bridge. And for those in the Bangor's small queer community, the fear was immediate. Because this wasn't just a death. This wasn't just a drowning. This was a message. And the person it silenced had spent his life refusing to be silent. There was no vigil that night, no crowd gathered on the bridge. Not yet. But the Condestag kept moving, quiet, uninterrupted, as if nothing happened. And for a few hours, it was like the whole town held its breath, waiting to see if anyone would name what this really was. A hate crime against an openly gay man, a man that whether they liked it or not was a member of their community. The police, as far as the investigation went, didn't have to put out an APB. They didn't have to knock on doors, because the truth came to them. Less than 24 hours after Charlie Howard's body was pulled from the stream, one of the three boys responsible, James Baines, age 15, walked into the Bangor police station with his father and gave a statement. According to the official police report, he sat down across from the detectives and confessed. There was no lawyer, no dramatic pause. He told them everything. He told them that they had seen Charlie and Roy walking across the bridge, that they had followed them, that they attacked Charlie, and that they had thrown him in, knowing he couldn't swim. And he named names. Sean Mabry, 16, and Daniel Ness, 17. Both had been in the car with him. Both had gotten out, and both had participated. Police moved quickly. By the following evening, all three boys were in custody. There was no standoff, no denials. They were arrested, processed, and charged under Maine's Juvenile Criminal Code. The charge? Manslaughter, which, you know how that goes. At first, authorities withheld their names due to their age, but this was Bangor, a town of just over 30,000, and within days, the names were circulating. First among high school students, then the press, and then the entire city. According to detectives, the boys gave consistent statements. All three confirmed the events of that night. They had chased Charlie and Roy across the bridge, but Charlie had fallen behind, that they had assaulted him, and that Mabry and Baines had picked him up and thrown him into the water. Ness insisted he didn't touch Charlie, but admitted he watched.
Like that makes it any better.
During the interviews, the boys offered varying motives. One, they said they just wanted to scare him. Another said they thought it would be funny. One even claimed that they didn't know Charlie was gay. But that claim unraveled quickly, because according to court transcripts and multiple witnesses, one of them had used the words, "Let's go beat up a faggot." And they had.
Yeah, that's pretty damning when multiple people have heard you say that, so it's
Yeah, they went back to a house party and bragged about this afterwards.
And that's the part too. It's always, it's so funny when they do this, ha ha ha, until they actually get caught for it. And then it's, well, I didn't know, like, oh, we didn't know, yada, yada, yada. So it's so funny to see how they like to act big and tough, but then when they actually like, oh, I'm actually in trouble, and then they turn into crying little biatches.
Well, something actually stood out to police as the teenagers gave their confessions. There was no sign of remorse. According to official statements and investigative records, they described what they did without emotion, even laughing at points. They spoke about the attack as if it was just a prank, something impulsive, even amusing. There was no apology, no visible guilt, just a chilling indifference to the fact that they had taken someone's life. The Bangor police had their suspects, the DA had their case, but what they didn't have, what the law in 1984 didn't provide, was a charge that matched the nature of the crime. Maine had no hate crime statute. There was no legal way to elevate the charge based on motive. No statute that differentiated between killing someone in a bar fight and killing someone because of who they were. So the prosecution pursued what the legal system allowed: manslaughter. The queer community in Bangor and beyond reacted with outrage. Interweave, the Unitarian Church queer support group where Charlie and Roy had met, issued a public statement demanding justice. The Maine Lesbian Gay Political Alliance, which formed shortly afterwards, called the charge a moral failure, but prosecutors pushed back. They argued that under current law, they could not charge the boys as adults, that the threshold for first-degree or second-degree murder hadn't been met, that this was the strongest legal route available. Behind the scenes, the district attorney's office debated whether to argue for special circumstances to try the boys in an adult court. But the case was already moving quickly, and there was little precedence for escalating charges in a case involving juvenile offenders and bias-based violence. So the boys remained in the juvenile system, shielded from a public trial, their proceedings closed, their records sealed, and public reaction was fractured. Some in Bangor, particularly the older, more conservative circles, expressed sympathy for the boys. They were just kids, people said. They made a mistake. There were calls for forgiveness. Articles in the Bangor Daily News featured phrases like tragedy for all involved and teen prank turned deadly.
I mean, we still see that very much today in a lot of cases, and a lot of cases involving minorities, and especially when it's cases involving, if it's, a white person that murders a minority person, all of a sudden it's a tragedy or it was an accident. But if it's a minority that murders a white person, all of a sudden it's a vicious, brutal murder. And you also notice how the media, and this is like a real phenomenon, I'm not making this up, how if the attacker is white, they'll use like a photo from like their high school graduation or their college graduation, like to describe how they murdered someone. But if it's a minority, all of a sudden it's, oh, here's a mugshot from when they were arrested on like a drug charge 20 years ago. See, they're a criminal. And it's very disturbing to see. And it's rage bait, of course, to see how the two are presented. And so not much has changed since 1984, sadly.
When friends of Charlie read those headlines, the words rang hollow. There was nothing prankish about it. Charlie hadn't been goaded into a fight. He hadn't provoked anyone. He had just been walking with his partner, and he had been hunted for that. And in the background of the investigation, another thread emerged. This wasn't the first time. At least 2 other community members came forward to say that they had previously been harassed by one or more of the boys. Slurs shouted from passing cars, bottles thrown, threats made, and none of it had been reported. There was no paper trail, but now at least it formed a pattern. And that pattern, unspoken but present, was one the town had quietly allowed to exist. The queer community, still in its infancy as a political force in Maine, began to speak out. Letters to the editor, community meetings, one pastor at a local church broke with his denomination and condemned the killing as a symptom of a deeper sickness. But others weren't ready to listen. At the site of Charlie's death, someone spray-painted "Fags Deserve to Die" on the concrete wall below the bridge in crude red letters, and they stayed up there for days. This wasn't an isolated act. At Bangor High School, where at least 2 of the boys had been students, a small group of classmates began referring to the Condestag stream as Chuckahomo River. Students who had known Charlie described a culture of silence. Queer kids were bullied, and teachers knew it and ignored it. Administrators looked the other way, and former classmates later said everybody knew what Charlie dealt with, and nobody did anything. The law enforcement investigation had concluded swiftly, but what it revealed the social climate that allowed this to happen was far from resolved. Even within the juvenile court system, there were challenges. The families of the three boys gave minimal public comments, and in court they expressed remorse. Of course, in court they did.
Always, yeah.
Lawyers emphasized the boys' ages, said they were products of a culture and not hardened criminals, that with treatment and education, they could be rehabilitated. There was no jail time on the table, no adult sentence. At most, they would be confined to the Maine Youth Center, the state's juvenile detention center, until they turned 21. For many in Bangor and across the state, that wasn't enough, because by then, it was clear this wasn't a one-off act of teenage violence. This was a hate crime before the law had a language to name it. And the investigation, fast, efficient, and by the book, had done little to address the question that lingered beneath every news headline and town hall conversation. What happens when a system says a life like Charlie's doesn't carry the same weight as others? By the fall of 1984, just 3 months after Charlie Howard's death, the legal process reached its quiet, clinical conclusion. On October 1st, the three teenagers, Sean Mabry, James Baines, and Daniel Ness, were each found guilty of manslaughter and sentenced to the Maine Youth Center, the state's juvenile detention facility. None of them would serve beyond their 21st birthday. There was no public trial, no full airing of testimony, no cross-examination in front of the community. The proceedings were sealed under Maine's juvenile court rules. The boys were not labeled murderers. They were not tried as adults. They were described on paper as delinquent youths. For many, this moment landed not as closure, but as a gut punch. According to sentencing records, Sean Mabry would serve about 22 months. James Baines served just under 2 years, and the exact length of Daniel Ness's confinement remains unclear. There was no formal probation, no public conditions. When they were released, they were returned to life outside the public eye. And that could have been the end of it. A hate crime committed before the term even existed in the state law, a victim buried, a town changed, but not necessarily moved. But what happened next altered the trajectory of the case and Maine's broader cultural reckoning. In 1994, 10 years after Charlie's murder, James Baines came forward publicly. He co-authored a memoir titled Penitence, A True Story, in which he acknowledged his role in the killing and confronted his past. The book was part confession, part reckoning, part warning. He detailed the night of the murder in unflinching terms, admitted his participation without excuse, and called the act what it was: hate. In public appearances and interviews, Baines spoke candidly about the violence he had committed. He described being raised in a homophobic environment, steeped in language and attitudes that normalized cruelty towards gay people. He didn't offer this as a defense. He said plainly that he had taken a life, and he said he lived with that every day. That turn, however late, was unexpected in the least. Baines began working with queer and anti-violence groups. He spoke at events, schools, and forums, often invited by the community leaders who once might have feared or hated him. One local activist described it as an act of moral restitution, not redemption, but responsibility.
You know what? I actually didn't know that part about the story, and no, it doesn't absolve him of what he did, and definitely the sentence did not match the crime. Should have been a lot worse. However, best case scenario with the sentence we got, I think this is the best case scenario, and if he's doing all this, at least he saw what he did and is making efforts to change and to advocate. So, again, I'm not being like, oh, it's all better because, it's not okay. But at the same time, worst case scenario, he kept on being hateful and hurting other people. Best case scenario, he is feeling the guilt and he is making strides to at least, he'll never make up for taking his life, but at least helping the current community. So that, very surprising. Yeah, also very surprising, but I'm glad that he made that change and didn't go the complete opposite.
And around the same time, Sean Mabry also issued a public statement. Though less visible and not attached to a book, Mabry acknowledged his role in the killing in an interview with a local reporter. He said that he thought about Charlie every day and that he was sorry and that he wished he could take it back. But not everyone accepted their remorse. For many of Charlie's friends, especially those in Bangor's queer community, it was hard to see the boys, now men, walking free, speaking at podiums and publishing their reflections. Some questioned whether their apologies were genuine or opportunistic. Others simply couldn't bear to hear it. And Roy Ogden, Charlie's partner who had witnessed the attack, who had pulled the fire alarm that night, who had lived with the trauma, remained largely out of the public spotlight. He gave very few public statements in the years that followed, but those that knew him said the grief never left.
And that's also a very valid thing, like those men are not owed forgiveness. You can't really come back from intentionally murdering someone maliciously like that, like unprompted, unprovoked. So very valid if people do not want to forgive them. And it's just one of those situations that's, I couldn't imagine being in that position.
Still, the most lasting twist in this case wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the community. The slow realization that the violence that took Charlie's life wasn't just the act of three teenagers. It was the product of silence, of systems, of looking the other way. And as the truth settled in, Bangor could no longer say, "We didn't know," because now they did. And things would never be the same because the community wouldn't let it. The murder of Charlie Howard, once treated as a private tragedy, a juvenile incident, started to take on a wider meaning. People began to use Charlie's name, not just in mourning, but in organizing. In 1985, just 1 year after Charlie's death, activists across the state founded the Maine Lesbian Gay Political Alliance. Their mission was unapologetic: to protect queer lives, to fight for legal protections in housing, employment, and education, and to make sure that no one else endured what Charlie did, at least not in silence. They lobbied legislators, created hotlines for queer youth, trained teachers, built networks, and over time their efforts reshaped the legal and social landscape of Maine. In 2004, the organization officially renamed itself Equality Maine and continues today as one of the state's leading civil rights groups. Still, remembrance wasn't universal. In 1985, a letter to the editor of the Bangor Daily News dismissed the killings as an unfortunate accident. Some claimed the boys didn't mean to kill anyone. Others described Charlie as provocative. And many in Bangor still refused to speak his name aloud at all.
It's the same thing people like that use when a girl says she's assaulted. It's, oh, what was she wearing? And it drives me up the wall when people say stuff like that. It's like, you'd be pissed too if you said something happened to you. The first words out of my mouth were, well, what were you wearing? It's so disgusting. It's horrible that it's kind of been normalized in society for a lot of people.
But you know who wouldn't let his name disappear? His friends. Those around who loved Charlie refused to let him disappear. Through it all, Roy Ogden, Charlie's partner, remained largely silent. He moved away from Bangor, declined interviews, and he attended some of the early memorials, but he never spoke publicly. At the 20th anniversary ceremony in 2004, he was seen quietly scattering flowers into the stream, and someone placed a white lily at his feet. He said nothing, but he didn't need to. By then, Bangor had begun to change. In 1998, after 14 years of advocacy, a small granite memorial was finally installed near the bridge. It read, "Charlie Howard, July 7th, 1984. Thrown off this bridge for being gay. We remember." One of these days, I'm going to get through one of these without getting emotional.
No, that's what a lot of people also said in their, their comments about the episode is they love how emotional Brad gets. They love the passion in it, and that's one of the things I love about the podcast is we do put a lot of emotion into it. So people enjoy the crying because it is something to really cry about because, again, that sums it up perfectly. Thrown off this bridge for being gay. no hateful, no fight, literally walking down the street and enjoying the night, enjoying the town. And it's just so crazy to think that people hate you for literally something that has no effect on them to the point where they will murder you. And this is why we do the podcast, is to cover cases like this and remember people like Charlie who put their lives on the line to live unapologetically as themselves and to be examples for other members of the queer community who may not have that kind of ability to live like that openly.
And one of the other things you guys have to take into account is you guys are hearing the script of this. This isn't all of the research that goes into making the script, all that you get to read about the person. By the time you've went through and read about this person's entire life, you get a little attached. So, and especially something like this that is just so callous, so such just wasting a life.
I think, yeah, in the cases we cover that are just straight hate crimes, because, we cover a lot of crimes and cases that a lot of times being gay may have a direct relation to it, but when it's cases where it's just straight up, this was just a person minding their business and they were brutally murdered for being gay, it's always really extra hard, I think, because it just really grounds you in the harsh reality that a lot of queer people have to face even today.
Yeah, I think it's honestly that hate that makes me so emotional. If you listen to our Patreon episode where I talked about the Two-Spirit, that's the hardest episode I have ever done. It's just because it's such a waste of life for no reason except for hate. And that is I just can't wrap my head around it. So I wrap emotion around it. So that's where we're at. So they finally put up a plaque. And of course, there was no ribbon cutting, no ceremony. But that bridge was no longer anonymous. Then, in 2004, on the 20th anniversary of Charlie's death, more than 300 people gathered for a public memorial at the site. For the first time, city officials and Bangor police attended the vigil. That same year, residents formed the Charlie Howard Memorial Committee, and a new tradition began. Each July 7th, a flower casting ceremony into the Condestag stream. It's simple. People gather, they speak, and then one by one, they drop white flowers, often lilies, into the water. One for every year that Charlie's been gone. Over time, Charlie's name spread beyond Bangor, and this gets to where Jordy
I was about to
knows this
say,
case.
this is where I know the case from, and this is actually probably where a lot of you know this case from, even if you didn't know the name or the details of it, you know this next detail.
In 1999, author Stephen King, who grew up in Bangor, published Hearts in Atlantis, which referenced a hate crime inspired by Charlie's murder. In interviews, King said the incident haunted him and that it shaped his portrayals of small-town violence and bigotry. He later paid a direct tribute in the It miniseries adaptation, whose opening hate crime scene was inspired by Charlie's case. And it's also in the movie.
Mm-hmm.
In 2019, for the 35th anniversary, Maine Public Radio aired a special retrospective on Charlie's murder. It featured rare interviews with Interweave members and archival audio from Roy Ogden, taken from a private memorial. In it, Roy described Charlie as unapologetically himself, even when the world punished him for it. And then, in 2020, the memorial was defaced. Red spray paint, a slur, and a crude message of hate. And it was cleaned within a few hours this time. The next morning, volunteers arrived, some with flowers, some with children, some in silence, and a local teacher brought her entire civics class. A bakery donated cookies. One parent holding their child was heard saying, "This is who we are now." Bangor today is not the same city it was in 1984. There's a queer youth center, a GSA network, and local schools. Pride flags hang from shop windows, and every summer, Bangor's Pride Parade takes a deliberate path across the State Street Bridge. Each July 7th, the community returns Charlie's mother, who passed away in 2009, once said in an interview that the stream gave her nightmares, that she could never bring herself to visit. But she hoped that someday the city would remember not just her son's death, but his joy, his art, and his love. And that is the legacy that floats down the Candustic stream each year. Not only grief, but resilience, memory, and the quiet insistence that Charlie Howard was here and that he mattered. Charlie's voice isn't recorded in audio, his laugh isn't preserved in video, but his story, its tenderness, its violence, and its aftermath lives in the space between silence and action. A former Interweave member once said, "Charlie taught us how to live without apology. His death taught us how dangerous that can be. But his memory teaches us not to disappear." And maybe that's the point of remembrance. Not to soften what happened, not to make it right, but to keep saying his name out loud without fear. Charlie Howard, July 7th, 1984, Bangor, Maine. Thrown off a bridge for being gay. We remember, and now you will too.
I was about to say, I think you're going to have some people crying on their way to work Monday when they listen to this episode. Whew. I mean, even I'm getting a little teary-eyed. That was a really good presentation of that case. I think I say it every week, but I think this is probably the best episode you've done. And yeah, I'm going to give Brad a minute because he is he is crying. And I'm laughing because that's how I deal with to keep myself from crying. But it's so true.
It's just the way, and they really did capture it. Thrown off a bridge for being gay.
And like Brad said, it's the fact that I can't wrap my head around just the amount of hate. You can hate a lot of things, but to hate something to the point that you callously take the life of someone else who wasn't hurting you, wasn't doing anything. I think that's what gets me the most is just like, you can't, like, if, they're like, did he say something to you? Did he push you? Did he make fun of you? Did he do something? And the fact they have to sit there and be like, no, he was just walking. He's like, but we thought he was gay, so we thought it'd be funny if we did.
Killed him.
Yeah. And it's like, I can't make sense of that in my head, and I don't think anyone can.
I really can't make sense of somebody even vocalizing their hate, like yelling slurs or anything like that. So for someone to murder someone over it, it's unbelievable, and I hate that it happens,
I do, and I think part of me is like, I guess the naive part of me, where it's like, it's hard for me to imagine there are genuinely that evil of people out there, because a lot of times I try to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, but then to realize there are people like this where it's like, no, there's just some people who are just that evil.
These were kids too.
And the fact that they were kids. And I'm going to be the one to say it starts at home. So I'd
100% starts at home. And that's what really came out with this case was Bangor allowed this to happen. These small town communities where everyone saw what was happening to Charlie. If they weren't involved with it, which a lot of people were actually involved in the hate against him. But even those that were on the outside just seeing it, they all saw it and they didn't say anything. They allowed it to happen.
I think this is a good example of, while a lot of people who aren't queer are always like, oh, well, why do gay people get pride parades? Why do you have to flaunt it and all this? This is why you have to flaunt it, quote unquote. Because if you don't remind people, like, we're here, we're queer, we're not going anywhere, and you're not going to bully us into silence, it does create a type of echo chamber of hate where it's like this, where it builds and builds until something horrible like this happens. And then all of a sudden it's, oh, this is what this was all leading to when we don't talk about this type of stuff. And so it's a good reminder of why we have pride in the first place, which is to normalize being openly queer so you can just walk down a bridge and not have to worry about getting murdered for it.
And this is also a very important reminder of why we have hate crime laws, because people can kill you for just hate. But if there's no law that specifically states you can't do that, then they can just get manslaughter. And so this is why they're so important to have hate crime laws and protection laws for people, especially, again, I keep going back to the trans people that just keep getting these protections stripped away from them constantly. There's a reason those laws exist. And even with those laws, they live one of the most dangerous lives out there. So you're going to strip the protections from people who are already living one of the most dangerous lives they could be. I just don't understand it.
And that's why we just keep fighting the good fight out there. It can get long, it can get tiring, but you can never give up.
And that's also why it's important, if you're an ally, to say something. Like, don't be one of those people that sees it happening and says, that's none of my business. It's not right. That's your business. If you think that it's not right to treat a person, a human being, in a certain way, speak up. Because people will get this mob mentality and they think everybody's on my side because we're all the same. We're normal. So we can do whatever we want to these people who aren't normal.
Yeah, I mean, that's true. It's like, it also starts in your life too. Like, there's a meme that makes its rounds usually every Pride Month, but it's like, just a reminder, sister, if your boyfriend's homophobic, so are you. And it's very much true. Like, I mean, you can say you're a supporter all you want, but if your partner is going around being like, all fags go to hell, and you just sit there and ignore it, I mean, you're not much better. Sorry to say, but well, actually, I'm not sorry, but, call it what it is. But with that, thank you again so much, Brad, for that very well researched, very well told, very haunting episode. I think that was the perfect blend of everything everyone asked for. Again, let us know your feedback. Highly appreciative. But I think, like I said, I loved it. I think that was Brad's best episode. And this was such an important case to tell, especially this close to Pride Month. So thank you again. And thank you guys for continuing to support the podcast so we can continue to remember people like Charlie and make sure that his story and so many stories like his are never forgotten. If you enjoyed this podcast and this episode, please leave us a 5-star rating or review on iTunes or Spotify. Helps us out a lot, helps other people discover the podcast, and of course, we just love hearing from you guys. If you want to see photos from today's case, you can follow us on Instagram at Beers with Queers Pod, that's POD, or on Facebook at Beers with Queers, a true crime podcast. And until next time, stay safe, love each other, and stay dangerous out there, my friend.
And give me some feedback because, again, I want to make this podcast the best that I can for you guys.
And I think he's doing that. So thank you guys again.
See ya.